Throughout my playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom, one thing has been very clear to me. We're not in Hyrule anymore, Epona. Or at least not the Hyrule that we knew from all previous games. No matter how you feel about certain aspects of the story in this game, it's undeniable that there's something very different from the prior timeline lore established. So take a seat and let's find out what's truly canon. Now first off, what makes me say that this isn't in the previously established lore and timeline? Well, I have an amazing video for here in the description where I describe why it doesn't work within the timeline. But to save you from watching that, I'll briefly explain. Essentially, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom decided to pull in aspects that were previously established to only exist in one continuity or branch of the timeline, and bring it all the way to the founding of Hyrule. For example, with the Zoras and Rito existing alongside one another. In the pre-established lore of the games, it was the Rito that descended from the Zora after the Great Flood, so by then having them both cohabitate at the beginning of the timeline would make zero sense. Another thing, while we don't see any Koroks in ancient Hyrule, we do know from Wind Waker that Koroks descended from the Forest Kokiri, and if the Kokiri did exist at this time of ancient Hyrule, then surely one of them would be a sage much like Saria or Fado. So with that, we can pretty well guarantee that Tears of the Kingdom doesn't take place in the Hyrule we knew. But that brings up an interesting counterpoint brought to my attention by the comments of that video. What if this is just Hyrule 2.0? Many people insist on this game taking place so far in the future that any name or history resembling Hyrule no longer exists. And if I'm being completely honest, that idea is pretty silly. If you think about it, is that not just a reboot? If the only remnants of the past games are just legend, myth, or even less, do they even really have bearing on the current chronology? The game even includes clear nods or full-on items from past games, but with a clear separation from the original counterpart power-wise, i.e. Fierce Deity Sword or the Twilight Bow. Now with either version of the continuity, it is undeniable that there are still parts that link the franchise together. First off, I think we should look at the Great Deku Tree. The Deku Tree is known for persisting through many eras of Zelda, from our first encounter in Ocarina of Time, then with his sapling 7 years later, and eventually presumably the same sapling many centuries later in the Forest Haven, all the way to the Common Era with the current Deku Tree from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. We can't say for sure how many generations down from Ocarina of Time the Great Deku Tree is, but it's a lot. By that, we should assume Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker to be in the current continuity, right? Well, not exactly. Since neither have both Rito and Zoras, it gets pretty convoluted to make it work. You could say the Rito and Zora de-evolved depending on the situation, but that's just silly. Rather, we could say the Great Deku Tree did exist and these events did happen, just not in this specific way. The stories we played were more like legends. Legends of Zelda. Well, you've probably heard that line before. It works. If we look at all these games, they're each in very different art styles and tones. After all, art styles from Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were so different that it tricked everyone into liking the wrong game for 10 years. These varying art styles and tones could just be interpretations from different storytellers. We could even say Hyrule Warriors was just a type of fanfiction made by some Hylian boy talking about his favorite stories and bringing them together. Most games could even just be retellings of the same original story, but altered so much they're nearly unrecognizable. Try this. What Zelda game am I talking about? There was once a hero named Link, who woke up in a very strange circumstance. He followed the guidance of someone close to him, and it led him to an encounter with a dark and evil force. After the encounter, he was sent on a mission to gather several mystical objects and rescue the kingdom. I might have missed a few details, but what game do you think I'm talking about? Ocarina of Time? A Link to the Past? Wind Waker? Well, it could be all of those, and probably a few more titles with a little bit of word manipulation. But it clearly shows a link in all the titles. But if I'm being honest, I'm not satisfied by the it's a legend idea. I mean, each game might look similar when I use the right description, but there's still huge aspects that separate each game. For one, all of Majora's Mask. That game can still fall in line with most of my description, but when you look at it like that, you lose everything that made it unique. And then you have a game like Wind Waker. It used the story of Ocarina of Time in such a great way to show the change and evolution of Hyrule, and I believe discrediting all these games is a bit disrespectful. With that, I want to take it at a different angle. If each game really is as simple as a story, then what story is most accurate, or at the least, what story still impacts the characters? By the way, the answer from earlier was the Minish Cap. Well, I think the best way to see what's still canonical is by looking at Tears of the Kingdom and seeing what they chose to focus on. In the past, I've drawn connections from Ocarina of Time to Tears of the Kingdom with some direct parallels in the stories, but I'd like to say I would rather associate that with the Legends and Myths theory rather than a direct timeline, since Tears of the Kingdom really does act as a retelling of Ocarina of Time, or the other way around, with the rise of Ganondorf and the fall of Hyrule because of him. So what else do we have? Well, we have Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, and the Master Sword. We have some elements of the Triforce, but we've only ever seen it with Zelda, and it could just be from her ancestry rather than specifically the Triforce. Another thing we have is landmarks that appeared across Hyrule from all over the series, and we even have Beetle. Well, with that, I think I know exactly what's still canon, and you can find that out by subscribing and hitting the bell to see all future videos. Or you could just watch the rest of this video. It all goes back to the first group. We have Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, and the Master Sword. There's only one place that set these four to battle on forever, and that's the lovable and hateable Skyward Sword, with the mostly hateable, but let's face it, still lovable demise. If you don't know, Skyward Sword revolves around the construction of the Master Sword and the destruction of Demise in the earliest era of Hylians before Hyrule's founding. Our companion throughout the game is the annoyingly charming Fi, the spirit of the Master Sword. The game ends with Demise cursing Link, Zelda, and consequently the Master Sword to fight an incarnation of him for all time. If we return to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there's one thing that has undeniably returned from Skyward Sword: Fi. Whether it's a small leitmotif when they interact with the Master Sword, or the Master Sword talking to Zelda in a time of need, Fi is still there. And further, we even see remnants of Skyward Sword's service with the Three Springs and the Great Hylia statue. There's a reason I brought up Demise as well. If it's true that all other games are just legends of the Imprisoning War, then that could mean that there was only ever one true evil from the founding of Hyrule to Tears of the Kingdom, and that was Ganondorf. Any diversions from that could be fanfictions, or evils of another land, and maybe a misinterpretation of Calamity Ganon. Maybe there never was a Pig Ganon. It could have been inspired by Calamity Ganon, since he would have attacked Hyrule numerous times throughout the centuries. Now, with Ganondorf destroyed, who will take up the next villainous spot? I think Nintendo and Fujibayashi have freed themselves from any legacy villains, and now have no necessity to make any more Ganons. And if that's the case, I think I can live with Tears of the Kingdom being the last interpretation. He's incredibly flawed, but admittedly sick as hell. With a lot more screen time and a lot more menace in a future DLC, he could be comparable to Twilight/Wind Waker Ganon. So I suppose the current timeline of Zelda is Skyward Sword, followed by Zonai Rauru and Hylia Sonia founding Hyrule, the Imprisoning War leaving Ganondorf underground leaking malice, 100,000 years or so of Calamity Ganon with Legends and Myths of Link and Zelda, and reincarnations of them defeating the Calamities, and finally, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom killing Ganondorf for good. Maybe. Now, would I be honest if I said I would like it if this was exactly how it turned out? Well, definitely not. But I do feel that this is the case, and I can accept it. And if you can accept it, let me know. And while you're at it, subscribe. I make Nintendo videos, and if you like that, then I'll keep doing it. But anyways, check under the bed for goblins, and always keep cool. Bye!